So I'll be talking about globalization today. So the topic that I chose was Sinking Globalization, which was one of the reaction papers we had to do, which was done by Niall Ferguson. So the reason I chose this was basically because I felt that I really agreed with the majority of what was talked about in the article, and I understood it and comprehended what they were talking about, and I kind of felt that it was one that I would be interested in presenting. So background information. So globalization is defined as the tendency of business, technologies or philosophies to spread throughout the world, or the process of making it happen. See, it starts off with our reaction paper in the article when the Crusade line, the Lusitania, was sank by the Germans, and it symbolized really the first age of globalization. And then this went on to, it started from 1870 and carried on until World War I, when the world's economy produced results that would be similar to what we would see in today's society. And that reached record levels as shown, and the telegraphs across the Atlantic were busier than anything ever witnessed before. And basically, the capital, as migrants traveled west and raw materials traveled east, was another sort of example of this shown. So the first subcategory I looked at was Back to the Future. It talks about how the last stage of globalization had the US economy as the biggest in the world. And then, however, at that time, China was still opening up, raising all kinds of expectations in the West. And then the also superpower at the time, the giant, was Russia, which was growing very rapidly. So World War I affected so many industries and areas, as shown. An example of this was a number of major economies, including the Germans, who did sink the ship originally, suffered from both hyperinflation and steep deflation in the space of 1 decade. So then looking at the giants with the ones I've talked about before, the world at the time, they were affected like this. So if you see them being affected like this, imagine what it was like for the countries that relied on them to handle their situations and that were basically looking after them, their allies. So carrying on with Back to the Future, we look at the last week of July 1914, when the world's stock market, including New York, collapsed and closed for the rest of the year. And economist John Maynard believed that this wouldn't last more than a year. That's what he thought originally. And then summing up this little subcategory, we can say that there are 5 main factors that led to the 1914 to 1918 crisis. The first being imperial overstretch, the second being the great power rivalry, third being unstable alliance systems, and the fourth was the presence of a rogue regime sponsoring terror. And the fifth and final was the rise of a revolutionary terrorist organization hostile to capitalism. So the next subcategory I chose, which is the last one, looks at the past and goes from the past, basically that's what it's titled. It looks at the past and how decisions from the past may affect us nowadays and in the future. So the first policy they actually looked at was the surge of the baby boomers retire, and it starts to claim social security and medical benefits, which ultimately could raise nations' GDPs, which would cause issues. And then obviously China had no obvious incentive to pick up the fight with the United States. But China ambitions with respect to Taiwan were not about to disappear just because Beijing owned a stack of US Treasury bonds. So this means that even though there was the past, you still see that China had to be involved in some way. And then to finish off my conclusion of this reaction paper, globalization has caused many issues in the last century. But it's also brought many positives and successes to the world. There's always been a risk of another September 11th, unfortunately, in the US with all their rivalries, and even with World War I, like in 1914. However, when globalization sunk, it really showed how something as small as sinking globalization can nearly destroy a whole society and world and economy system. And I believe that we just need to try and contain globalization to a point where it doesn't get out of hand and cannot destroy our world and its economy. But to do that, we all do need to work together, and I think from there we'll be able to work. And then finally, my references.